You quote in your article Karl Marx writing, "The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships." Marx wrote, "The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas." Why did that hit you?
Well, because the whole notion of the free market, laissez-faire capitalism, globalization, is a very thin rationale for unmitigated greed by a tiny oligarchic elite. And they have made sure that that ideology is taught in universities across the country. And people, like especially economists, who deviate from that ideology have been pushed aside and become pariahs. And yet the driving ethos of that ideology is really to justify the hoarding of immense amounts of wealth by a very tiny percentage of, the upper ruling class. That's what it is. I mean, the whole lie of globalization, perpetuated by people who popularize it, like Tom Friedman, has already been exposed. I mean, the idea that it's going to lift all of us up and create middle class and, well-compensated working class families in the third world. I mean, all of it's been exposed.
And I think part of his point is that this isn't just some innate ideas that everyone is essentially greedy, these people just happen to be rich and you're not as lucky or as smart as they are. It's that it comes from what he calls the material conditions, about like how stuff is owned, who has power as a result of concentration of ownership, how things are distributed. It's not that it doesn't have to be this way. It's a product of how the society is organized.
Right, and so in that sense, the ideology serves the system. The intellectual class serves the system. Those economists whose voices are heard, who get tenure, serve the system. And those who don't serve the system don't have a job. And that's what Marx was getting at, and I think that's extremely true. I mean, we don't live in a free market society. We live in a society where corporations at will loot the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve and are bailed out by the taxpayer. And yet that fact of kind of corporate socialism for corporations is ignored. And yet and that's dangerous, because there's an utter disconnect from the language that we use to describe our economic system and the reality of our economic system, which is essentially a system where corporations have become predators on government and taxpayer money. And we're all going to pay for it, because most of this stuff, all these bonds that they're buying up, is garbage. It is things like foreclosed homes that on the books are worth $600,000, but in reality, because the electricity has been turned off, the basement's flooded, you'd have to spend money to raise it, to put up anything of any kind of value. And that is going to blow right up in our face.
And this idea that you're expressing, that the majority of professional paid intellectuals, professors and writers and pundits, the idea that the free market is the fundamental assumption and starting point, to suggest anything else might work is sacrilegious. And then some people say, well, that's because America's always been like this. America's the center-right country. But it's not true. And pre-World War II in the 1930s and right after World War II, there was a big public debate about what kind of economy, what kind of politics. And there was a real campaign waged to get rid of public intellectuals, get rid of union militants, get rid of actors and directors. Right. Anyone that wanted to have this public discourse was hounded out of office.
I write Death of the Liberal Class is really that story. How all of these people were silenced, pushed to the margins, stripped of employment, including like even high school teachers. I mean, Ellen Schrecker, the historian, has done a good job on this.
Just quickly, for people to know what we're talking about the House of Un-American Activities, McCarthyism, and a real campaign to try to move anyone with a kind of progressive socialist idea out of anything.
And they were effective. I mean, in a way, far more effective than in Europe. I mean, in Europe, you'll still have a residue. Or we've been robbed of language by which we can express the reality of what we're undergoing. And that's because, our radical, populist, dissident movements, those who offered a critique of the power elite, have been banished or silenced.
Now, you write something here which, if you would not be allowed to say on mainstream news anywhere. You write, class struggle defines most of human history. Marx got this right. The sooner we realize that we're locked in a deadly warfare with our ruling corporate elite, the sooner we'll realize that these elites must be overthrown. There's a massive campaign not even to use the words class warfare. In fact, if you talk class, people accuse you of being essentially anti-American.
I don't think you can understand the nature of capitalism if you don't understand the nature of class warfare. If I was running a Wall Street firm, I'd only hire Marxian economists because they understand that capitalism is about exploitation. Marx got that right. And that gets back to the nature of the ruling elite. I mean, we are the most illusioned society on the planet. The airwaves are awash in lies. They very skillfully know how to humanize figures, I mean, even idiots like Donald Trump, to mask what it is they're actually doing to the rest of us. And I think we have to begin to puncture the very effective mirages that have been created. And corporations, of course, spend billions of dollars to create these mirages, to understand our reality. I mean, look at BP. You'd think BP was Greenpeace, given the amount of commercials that they're running about how much they care about the Gulf, when in fact they turn the waters of the Gulf into a dead zone and poisoned the shrimp and all of the other which they're selling us to eat. And yet we don't have mechanisms by which, or they're certainly within the mainstream, what major network is going to go do a serious documentary on BP? You're not going to confront those interests, because at this point these interests, they own or control the systems of information as well as the systems of education. Your article ends with, "The only route left to us, as Aristotle knew, is revolt." Well, because the mechanisms of incremental and piecemeal reform don't work. And you talked about the New Deal. The New Deal was the classic example of that kind of safety valve. And as Roosevelt said, I mean, his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. And in the stupidity of the corporate oligarchic elite, they destroyed the liberal class. I mean, we still have a self-identified liberal class, but they no longer do anything to defend the interests of those they claim to represent, whether that's the working class, the middle class, labor, or anyone else. And by destroying that safety valve, by destroying that liberal class, those mechanisms that made piecemeal and incremental reform possible, you no longer can adjust the system. So you can't ameliorate the suffering or the grievances of the underclass, and now we're talking about half the country. Now, that means that if you want to resist, if you want to create change, you can't do it through traditional political parties, you can't do it through the courts, you can't do it through a corporatized media. You have to step outside the system and create popular mechanisms, mass movements that will begin to put pressure in a cruder way on the centers of power. That is the only hope we have left. You say you can't do incremental reform. The elite can't even pass regulations that would serve their own interests in terms of controlling financial speculation, for example. A simple change in terms of position limits of the Commodities Future Trading Commission, that anyone that wants some kind of functioning capitalist system would want to have this, so that you don't have another financial collapse as of 2008. Right, they can't even pass that. Right, but they don't. The people who are running Wall Street don't give a damn about. They know it's going to collapse. And what they're doing is stealing as much as they can on the way out the door. There's a very deep cynicism. Well, they make money. They make money after the collapse as well, because they know the state's there to bail them out. So. Right, but this time around, it's going to be a little harder to pilfer state funds. I mean, they'll certainly attempt to do that, but the goal is so self-centered. You have, I think the head of United Healthcare made $1 billion. I mean, it's insane last year. I think I have that right. Certainly hundreds of millions of dollars to people, and it's all about amassing little monuments to themselves, little empires to themselves. I have relatives who work on Wall Street, and their critique is not any different from mine. The difference is they're just grabbing as much as they can on the way out the door. And I think that is always symptomatic of a kind of dying civilization.
Yeah, Marx was asked once to describe the psychology of a capitalist, and it was what we talked about a little earlier, après moi la déluge, after me come the floods.
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
get what I can today, and if the society is toast later, too bad.
And I think they know it's going to be toast. And I think they think that they're going to retreat into their gated compounds and survive it, and they may survive it longer than the rest of us, but in the end, climate change alone is going to get us.
So it's up to us. Don't expect anything from the oligarchs.
No, and not only that, they are creating systems in terms of exploitation, not only of us, but of the ecosystem, that if left unchecked, will ensure the extinction of the human species. It may already be too late, of course, but allowing the fossil fuel industry or these corporations to determine our relationship to the environment is a form of collective insanity at this point.
Thanks for joining us.